Welcome to the channel. Here, we dive into the past so that you can fall asleep easily and with benefit. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button, because by the end of this lecture, you'll be sleeping soundly. Close your eyes. History is already beginning. The history of humanity, as we know it, with states, armies, laws, writing systems, and monumental architecture, occupies only a tiny fragment of the overall chronological canvas. The vast majority of human existence took place long before the first cities appeared. This period, commonly referred to as prehistoric, spans hundreds of thousands of years and includes the most important stages: the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. It was during this time that basic skills, knowledge, and social practices were formed, without which no later civilization could have arisen. The Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, covers an enormous span of time, from the emergence of the first Homo species, about 5 million years ago, to the end of the last ice age, roughly the 10th millennium BCE. Homo sapiens, the wise human, appeared about 300,000 years ago in Africa and gradually spread across the Old World, first into Asia, then into Europe. Throughout the Paleolithic era, humans lived in conditions close to the animal world. They roamed, hunted, gathered fruits, roots and eggs, used stone tools and lived in caves or simple shelters. Nevertheless, even under these conditions, social life gradually became more complex. People formed groups, cared for the sick and elderly, buried the dead, decorated their bodies, and created rock art and ritual objects. All of this shows that the seeds of culture and religious consciousness were already taking shape. Famous examples include the Cro-Magnon sites in France, the renowned Lascaux cave with images of bulls and deer, and the so-called Paleolithic Venuses, female figurines with exaggerated forms likely symbolizing fertility. Around the end of the 10th millennium BCE, as the climate warmed and glaciers retreated, the Mesolithic period began, a transitional phase between the Paleolithic and Neolithic. Important changes took place during this time. Many large mammals that had been hunted disappeared. New landscapes emerged: steppes, forests and wetlands. Humans began using more diverse and sophisticated tools, including microliths, small insertable blades fitted into bone or wooden handles. Fishing and boating developed, nets and harpoons appeared, and animals began to be domesticated. Dogs, it seems, became humanity's first companions. However, the decisive step in human development came during the Neolithic, which began around 8000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. This region includes the modern territories of Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and southeastern Turkey. Here, evidence of settled life, agriculture, and animal husbandry first appeared. People began growing wheat, barley, peas, and lentils. They domesticated sheep and goats and later cattle and pigs. This event, known as the Neolithic Revolution, radically transformed human society. The main difference between agricultural society and hunter-gatherer society was that humans no longer depended solely on natural resources. They began producing food themselves, which allowed them to create reserves, sustain larger populations, and build permanent settlements. Life became more predictable, but new challenges emerged: the need to protect crops, allocate resources, and organize collective labor. The Neolithic also saw the emergence of the first villages. One of the oldest settlements of this kind is Jerma, in northern Iraq. This early Neolithic community consisted of rectangular houses with mud brick walls, where people cultivated grains and kept domestic animals. More complex and impressive was the settlement of Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, modern Turkey, dating to the 7th millennium BCE. Here, houses stood close together, had no doors, and were connected via rooftops. Inside the homes were altars, frescoes, and sculptures, indicating a developed religious worldview. At the same time, in Europe, the Tripoli culture spread, covering modern Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. Tripoli settlements sometimes reached enormous sizes, up to 100 hectares. Residents practiced agriculture, crafted exquisite painted pottery, and built round and rectangular houses grouped into complex villages with planned layouts. In China, the Neolithic Yangshao culture developed in parallel. Its people lived in the Yellow River Valley, cultivated millet, raised pigs, created pottery with geometric designs, and likely practiced basic forms of irrigation. These societies were independent and did not rely on influence from the Middle East. This is an important example showing that the transition to agriculture occurred simultaneously in different parts of the world. Thus, in Neolithic societies, we can already see the beginnings of phenomena that would shape civilizations: productive economy, sedentary life, population growth, social stratification, ritual practices, architecture, and division of labor. These were not yet states or empires, but they were no longer primitive tribes. This was the foundation from which the ancient world would grow. Despite this, under Naram-Su-En, the empire reached its maximum expansion, stretching west to the Mediterranean and east to Elam and the Zagros Mountains. However, it was under him that processes began, which ultimately led to the empire's decline. According to Sumerian legends, Naram-Su-En angered the gods by destroying the temple of Enlil in Nippur, and for this, the heavens turned away from humanity. These myths can be understood as a symbolic reflection of real events. Modern archaeological and climatological research shows that around the 20th century BCE, the region experienced sharp climate changes. A prolonged drought occurred, rivers dried up, and harvests fell. This led to famine, migrations, and unrest. All of this undermined the economic and military stability of the Akkadian state. Cities revolted, and in the northern borders, mountain tribes, the Gutians, became active, eventually delivering the decisive blow. By the middle of the 20th century BCE, the Akkadian Empire ceased to exist as a unified state. It was replaced by smaller local centers of power. And in southern Mesopotamia, a short but brilliant period of Sumerian revival began, the third dynasty of Ur. The Akkadian Empire left a deep legacy. Within its framework, the principle of centralized governance was implemented for the first time. On vast territories, the idea of universal royal authority emerged, and the Akkadian language became the first lingua franca of the ancient Near East. It was used in diplomacy and administration for many centuries. Although the state itself lasted only a short time, its institutions, language, and system of rule had a colossal influence on all subsequent states in the region. After the fall of the Akkadian Empire, Mesopotamia did not fall into complete decline. On the contrary, despite temporary political disintegration and destruction caused by the climate crisis and the Gutian invasion, by the beginning of the 21st century BCE, southern Mesopotamia began to rise again. This period is known as the Third Dynasty of Ur, a kind of neoclassicism of Sumerian civilization, an attempt to restore, organize, and synthesize the cultural achievements of previous centuries. The Third Dynasty of Ur ruled approximately from 2112 to 2004 BCE. Its founder, Ur-Nammu, was an outstanding ruler who unified southern Mesopotamia, liberating it from the Gutians, and proclaimed himself king of Sumer and Akkad. This title was a symbolic gesture, emphasizing continuity with both Sumerian culture and Akkadian political heritage. Here, historians see the beginnings of what is called the Sumerian-Akkadian cultural synthesis. In practice, this meant that the administrative apparatus continued to use Akkadian as the language of governance, while Sumerian remained the language of religion, literature, and temple education. Temples and palaces were adorned with inscriptions in both languages, and scribes were trained in both. Sumerian religious traditions were reinterpreted under imperial ideology, and Akkadian principles of centralized authority were integrated into the administrative system. The reigns of Ur-Nammu and his successor, Shulgi, were marked by large-scale construction and social reorganization. Major ziggurats were rebuilt, including the famous ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana. This temple, later becoming an architectural symbol of the Sumerian era, was both a cult and administrative center. In addition to architectural achievements, it was under Ur-Nammu that one of the earliest legal codes in human history appeared. The Code of Ur-Nammu predated the more famous Code of Hammurabi by nearly 300 years. It included laws on punishments for murder, theft, false accusations, and also regulated marriage and property relations. A notable feature of these laws was the presence of fixed penalties, a legal system in which punishments were predetermined, not arbitrary. The economy of the state was based on a centralized model of resource distribution. Lands formerly belonged to the temples and the king. Farmers received plots for rent and paid taxes in grain or labor. Temple and palace archives kept precise records. Clay tablets contained information on rations, work assignments, productivity, and supplies. In large cities such as Ur, Lhasa, and Eridu, schools for scribes, libraries, and literary archives appeared. Shulgi, son of Ur-Nammu, ruled for around 40 years, leaving behind an extensive collection of texts, hymns, autobiographies, and political manifestos. He continued policies of centralization and cultural integration, proclaiming himself a divine ruler. Under him, many new cults were created, and old mythological texts were revised, including cycles dedicated to Inanna and Dumuzi. However, by the end of the dynasty, the state began to weaken. Pressure from nomadic tribes from the west, mainly the Amurru, increased. The administrative system, having become too cumbersome, began to fail. By the beginning of the 20th century BCE, Ur's power was undermined, and around 2004 BCE, the city fell to external enemies. Nevertheless, the importance of the third dynasty of Ur is difficult to overstate. It was during this period that Sumerian culture was gathered, codified, and transmitted to future generations. The administrative, legal, architectural, and literary examples established under Ur-Nammu and Shulgi laid the foundation for Babylonian, Assyrian, and Hittite traditions. Sumerian civilization in its classical form came to an end, but its legacy became the foundation for the entire subsequent Near East. While Sumerian Akkadian civilizations developed in the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, empires were forming and the first laws were created. Around the same time, but independently, another civilization was emerging along the Nile, no less powerful and enduring. Mesopotamia and Egypt followed parallel paths. There were trade links between them, but cultural development occurred autonomously, shaped by unique landscapes, climates, and worldviews. When we think of ancient Egypt, we almost inevitably imagine the pyramids of the pharaohs, mysterious scripts, and gold. But all of this did not appear at once. Long before the construction of the pyramids at Giza, Egypt was a mosaic of independent communities along the banks of the Nile, a river without which Egyptian civilization would have been impossible. The Nile dictated the rhythm of life. Every year it flooded, covering fields and leaving fertile silt behind. Mastering this natural cycle, organizing irrigation and agriculture, required collective effort. Gradually, villages united into nomes, administrative districts, from which two centers of power emerged, one in the south in Upper Egypt, with its center at Nekhen, Greek Hierakonpolis, and another in the north, in Lower Egypt, with centers at Buto, later Memphis. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt became a turning point. According to traditional chronology, this occurred around the 31st century BCE. In Egyptian historiography, this moment marks the beginning of the Early Kingdom, also called the Dynastic Period, and the rule of the first pharaoh, Naama, later known as Menes. His famous palette, found at Hierakonpolis, depicts the ruler uniting Egypt, and the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt became one of the most important symbols of Egyptian monarchy. Political unification was accompanied by the creation of an administrative structure. A centralized state emerged with power concentrated in the hands of the pharaoh, literally the Great House. He was seen not just as a ruler, but as a living god, a bearer of divine order, Maat. The concept of Maat, cosmic harmony, truth and balance, became central to Egyptian ideas of state, law and religion. After the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and the establishment of the first pharaoh's authority, Egyptian civilization entered a new stage. If the early kingdom was a time of forming the foundations of state structure, symbolism and sacred authority, then in the Old Kingdom, Egypt became a truly centralized state, with a powerful administrative apparatus, a developed ideology of royal power, and monumental architecture unparalleled in the world. The Old Kingdom lasted approximately from the 27th to the 22nd century BCE, covering the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties. It was during this time that the most famous Egyptian monuments, the pyramids, were built, which remain symbols of ancient Egypt to this day. The beginning of the Old Kingdom is associated with Pharaoh Djoser of the 3rd dynasty. His reign was marked by architectural breakthroughs. In the necropolis of Saqqara, the first step pyramid in history was built. It was not just a tomb, but an entire complex combining administrative, religious, and funerary functions. The project was led by the legendary architect and priest Imhotep. Djoser's pyramid became not only a new form of architecture, but the first public expression of the pharaoh's divine authority. The tomb rose toward the sky, emphasizing the connection with the gods. During the 4th dynasty, Egypt entered its architectural peak. Pharaoh Sneferu, the dynasty's founder, built several pyramids, experimenting with their shape and construction. His son, Khufu, Greek Cheops, erected the Great Pyramid at Giza, the largest stone structure in history, built without iron tools or the wheel. He was followed by Khafra and Menkaura, under whom the Giza pyramid complex reached its final form. The Great Sphinx, a giant statue with a lion's body and a pharaoh's face, was likely created during Khafra's reign, becoming a symbol guarding the royal necropolis. These grand projects were made possible by a rigid, centralized system of governance. The pharaoh's power was considered absolute. He was seen not as an ordinary man, but as the living. By the end of the Old Kingdom, around the 23rd, 22nd centuries BCE, centralized authority began to weaken. The reasons were complex: internal dynastic conflicts, economic difficulties, possibly droughts and poor harvests, and the growing power of local nobility, the nomarchs, who gradually began to act independently of the pharaoh. The pharaoh's power, once perceived as absolute and divine, now became a subject of doubt. This marked the first transitional period, a time of instability, fragmentation, and cultural change. Egypt split into several competing centres, the largest of which were Heracleopolis in Lower Egypt and Thebes in Upper Egypt. Despite the political fragmentation, archaeological evidence shows that construction continued in the provinces, local art developed, and literacy became more widespread. This was a time of regional activity, not of cultural collapse. Around the 21st century BCE, a new dynasty emerged in Thebes, gradually subjugating the remaining territories. The founder of the Middle Kingdom, Mentuhotep II of the 11th dynasty, restored political unity to Egypt. From this moment, the era known as the Middle Kingdom began, lasting approximately from 2040 to 1780 BCE. The Middle Kingdom is considered Egypt's second classical period. Although it did not produce pyramids equal to those at Giza, it was marked by internal development, strengthening of bureaucracy, administrative reforms, and cultural consolidation. Pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom focused particularly on developing the provinces. Forts were built, roads and irrigation canals constructed, temples and tombs were established outside Memphis. The centre of power shifted to Thebes, which became the religious capital of the country. One of the key features of this era was the growth of the bureaucratic system. Administration was no longer simply subordinate to the pharaoh. It became a stable professional structure. Scribes, officials, administrators, army and temple officers, all of them became part of a new Egyptian elite. Their figures were increasingly depicted in sculpture, reliefs, and inscriptions. Another major shift was in religious thought. The cult of Osiris, god of death, resurrection, and the afterlife, began to occupy a central role. Previously, afterlife immortality was reserved for the pharaoh. Now, the idea of life after death gradually democratized. Anyone who lived according to the principles of Ma'at could hope for salvation. The myth of Osiris, murdered and resurrected, became the main religious narrative of the era. Funerary texts expanded, the so-called books of the afterlife appeared, and moral considerations gained importance. The Middle Kingdom was also a time of literature, philosophy, and reflection. Texts emerged that pondered the meaning of suffering, injustice, and fate. The personality of the pharaoh, while still sacred, was no longer entirely separate from society. Pharaohs of this period were often depicted not as gods, but as hardworking, just rulers. Thus, the Middle Kingdom represents not merely a political reorganization, but a profound internal rethinking of Egyptian statehood and religious systems. It laid the groundwork for further cultural achievements, showing that civilizations can not only fall, but also rise again, sometimes in a more mature, humane and sustainable form. While the Nile Valley established the political and religious model of the Middle Kingdom, far to the east, beyond the Iranian plateau, along another great river, the Indus, one of the most mysterious civilizations of the ancient world was developing. It is called the Harappan civilization, named after the first discovered archaeological sites. This culture existed alongside ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, yet it remains less studied, largely due to its undeciphered script and scarce inscriptions. Nevertheless, the scale and sophistication of this civilization are undeniable. Here, we see a true civilization. The Harappan civilization reached its peak between the 26th and 19th centuries BCE, spanning a vast area from modern eastern Pakistan to northwestern India. Its largest and best-studied centres were the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Both were located in the fertile Indus Valley and represented a unique phenomenon for their time. Carefully planned, engineered and organised, with regular city layouts, drainage, water supply and paved streets. Mohenjo-Daro, meaning Mound of the Dead in Sindhi, is particularly striking in its design. It was divided into two main parts: the citadel on a raised area, possibly the administrative and ritual centre, and the lower city, where most of the population lived. Within the citadel stood a monumental building known as the Great Bath, a rectangular pool built with brick with a drainage system and access to water. This structure likely served not only practical purposes, but also ritual ones, possibly connected with purification ceremonies. The urban planning of Harappan cities is impressive in its rationality. Streets intersected at right angles, districts were clearly organised. Houses were made of baked brick, unlike the unbaked brick common in Mesopotamia. Every house had access to water and sanitation, reflecting a high level of hygienic culture. These were not just settlements, they were true cities, governed by a centralised system, though one still unknown to us. A peculiarity of the Harappan civilization is that almost nothing is known about its rulers. No monumental depictions of kings or gods, no triumphal inscriptions, no glorification of military victories. It appears to have been a culture where order, infrastructure, production and trade were prioritised over dynasties and conquest. Archaeological finds indicate wide trade links with Mesopotamia, Central Asia and possibly the Persian Gulf. Seals with animal images and symbols were found, likely elements of an accounting or ownership system. These seals are one of the main sources of knowledge about Harappan script, which remains undeciphered. Despite its high level of development, the Harappan civilization began to decline around the 19th century BCE. The reasons are not fully clear, but researchers point to possible climate changes, alterations of the Indus River course, soil degradation, and internal problems such as the collapse of central administration or trade. Unlike Mesopotamia and Egypt, its decline was gradual, not catastrophic. Cities were abandoned, production slowed, and the centralized structure weakened. Yet, for centuries afterward, descendants continued to live in these territories, carrying forward its legacy. Thus, the Harappan civilization, with its organized cities, engineering sophistication, sanitation and craft, was one of the pinnacles of early urbanization. And while its language and religion remain a mystery, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro stand as a powerful reminder that civilization is not only about temples and kings, but also about water, roads, brick and order. If we look closely at the structure of the Indus cities, it becomes clear these were not just spontaneously grown settlements, but the product of careful organization and enduring tradition. What is particularly striking is that all major centers, from Harappa to Lothal, followed a common architectural and engineering principle, despite being hundreds of kilometers apart. This suggests the existence of a shared cultural standard, even if it wasn't formally recorded in a script we can read. Most likely, it was transmitted through craft guilds, oral tradition, and possibly a system of centralized training, proto-professional schools for architects, builders, and hydraulic engineers. In the urban layout, attention is drawn not only to the geometry of the streets, but also to how life was organized between the houses. Narrow alleys with drainage, intersections with wider spaces, possibly for shops or workshops. Residential houses were usually 2 stories, with stairs, inner courtyards and wells. All of this created an environment suited not just for life, but for comfort without ostentation. We see no luxurious palaces, no monumental temples. Everything was modest, yet well built. This suggests a more horizontal social structure, without a prominently visible royal elite. The economic side is equally fascinating. At first glance, the cities of the Indus Valley appear as administrative and craft centres, but many, such as Sut-Kargandor or Lothal, played key roles in maritime and river trade. At Lothal, archaeologists discovered a structure interpreted as a dock, a rectangular basin connected by a channel to the river. This indicates that the Harappan civilization had not just exchange, but a well-organised logistics system, taking tides and seasonal navigation into account. The existence of standardised weights and measures with stone weights points to a high degree of uniformity in economic operations. Seals, often found in trade and storage areas, may have served not only as property markers, but also as permits for access, contracts, or even early forms of branding. When decline begins, it does not appear as a catastrophe, but as gradual changes in everyday life. Pottery forms simplify, standard bricks disappear, the strictness of city planning weakens. Writing appears less frequently in archaeological layers. This is not collapse, it is the loss of system stability. It's as if the common algorithm that once connected cities, technologies and people into a unified cultural space is disappearing. Importantly, this decline coincides with the end of external trade. As contacts with Mesopotamia ceased, the influx of imported goods sharply decreased. Perhaps this dependency on exchange made the Harappan model vulnerable. With internal strain and external isolation, cities began to lose the function for which they existed. Thus, the Harappan civilization does not appear as a tragedy. It was an evolutionary conclusion of a social organization, focused not on power or repression, but on order, infrastructure, and daily stability. Although its script remains silent, the forms of this culture continue to speak. In the proportions of streets, in the structure of wells, in traces of coordination that once united thousands of people in a common purpose. Continuing our lecture, we now move from the mysterious, refined Indus civilization to another ancient and original cradle of human culture, the Yellow River Valley, where one of the oldest traditions was emerging, which would develop continuously up to the present day. We now travel to ancient China, at a time before empires, when the foundations of Chinese civilization were being laid. Agriculture, bronze production, ancestor rituals, and the first forms of centralized authority. While Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus were experiencing the rises and crises of their early states, in East Asia, in the valleys of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, cultural traditions were forming that would eventually give rise to the unique Chinese civilization. Although written sources from this era are almost non-existent, archaeology allows us to reconstruct the lives of the people at the origins of this tradition. One of the most important late Neolithic cultures in China was the Longshan culture, which existed roughly from the 3rd to the 2nd millennium BCE in what are now the Shandong, Henan and Shaanxi provinces. This society had well-organized agriculture, actively used pottery, including the so-called eggshell thin black ware, astonishing in both elegance and technical precision. The Longshan people cultivated millet, raised pigs, used oxen for labour, and built fortified settlements with rammed earth walls and moats. Archaeologists find evidence of social differentiation, burials with precious items, bronze and jade, indicating the emergence of elite layers. The Longshan culture represents a transition to proto-state formation. We see elements of centralization, ancestor cults, ritual pits, and offerings. In some settlements, early forms of writing were found, pictograms etched on bones or pottery. They do not yet form a complete system, but already indicate attempts to record information and sacred symbols. According to some researchers, the legendary Xia dynasty, the first dynasty in traditional Chinese historiography, may originate from Longshan. Information about Xia comes from later chronicles, such as the Shujing and the Bamboo Annals. The historicity of the Xia dynasty remains debated. Archaeological evidence is limited, and the dynasty itself may represent an idealized memory of early forms of authority. However, excavations at Erlitou, dating to the turn of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, suggest the existence of an early centralized society capable of building palace complexes, producing bronze vessels, and managing labor resources. Early II is associated not only chronologically, but also by the character of findings: clear city planning, palace remains, bronze artifacts, and jade burials. All of this indicates a complex society with emerging hierarchy, ritual, and possibly early elements of centralized power. Thus, even if the Xia dynasty cannot yet be fully confirmed archaeologically, the idea of an early centralized society in China at the turn of the 2nd millennium BCE is undeniable. This was a time when China moved from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, laying the foundations of statehood and spiritual tradition, ancestor worship, sacred authority, and a drive toward an ordered world, which would remain central to Chinese culture for centuries to come. We now move to the next important stage in the history of ancient China, the Shang dynasty. Unlike earlier cultures, this dynasty is no longer conditional or mythological. It is confirmed by extensive archaeological evidence. From this period, China steps firmly onto historical ground. We have written sources, material evidence, architectural remains, and clear signs of a complex state system. After the Longshan and early II cultures, associated with early forms of centralized administration, Chinese civilization enters a new phase. Around the 15th century BCE, in the area of modern Henan province, the first historically verified state in China emerges, the Shang, also known as the Yin dynasty. This is no longer a proto-state, it is a full bronze civilization with developed institutions of power, military organization, hieroglyphic writing, and a rich ritual culture. One of the main technological achievements of the Shang era was bronze casting, which reached astonishing complexity. Bronze was used not only for ritual vessels, but also for weapons: axes, spears, daggers, arrowheads. This indicates the importance of war and centralized resource mobilization. Bronze production required organized labor, from ore extraction to casting, involving hundreds of specialists. Craftsmen used modular clay molds, allowing highly detailed objects with inscriptions, ornaments, and images of animals and ancestors. Many of these objects had not only a practical function, but also a sacred role. However, the most remarkable legacy of the Shang period was not bronze artifacts, but oracle bones, the first written sources in Chinese history. These were ox scapulae and turtle shells, on which priests inscribed questions to ancestors and spirits about weather, harvest, war, and the king's health. After ritual heating, cracks formed, and their interpretation was recorded next to the question. These inscriptions, early forms of Chinese characters, offer a unique glimpse into the life, thought, and political system of the era. Importantly, the use of oracle bones demonstrates strict centralization of power and its sacred nature. Only the royal dynasty had the right to question the spirits and record the answers in writing. The priest and the king were parts of a single governing mechanism where power was both political and religious. The centre of the state was the city of the institution, usually called Yin, hence the alternative name for the dynasty. Here were royal palaces, workshops, storehouses, temples, tombs, and arsenals. Space was clearly organised, and the administrative system, according to finds, already included delegated local authority, tribute collection, and systematic record-keeping. Royal tombs in Shang are a separate topic. They impress with their scale, the richness of burial goods, and ritual complexity. The king was often buried with concubines, warriors, horses, and chariots. This demonstrates how closely intertwined power, ancestor worship, and beliefs about the afterlife were, seen as a continuation of the king's reign. Thus, the Shang dynasty becomes the first historically verified example of the ancient Chinese model of a state. Centralized, sacred, ritualized, and bureaucratic. Here, metallurgy meets magic, hieroglyphs meet power, offerings meet writing. Although Shang disappeared by the 10th century BCE, its structure, language, ideology, and rituals laid the foundation for the entire subsequent history of China. Now, we turn to the Bronze Age, an amazing period lasting roughly from 2000 to 1200 BCE. It was a time when the peoples of the ancient Near East began actively interacting, establishing international contacts, and forming the first powerful states. This era saw the rise and flourishing of Babylon, the great city in the fertile valley between the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. The name Babylon comes from the ancient Akkadian word meaning gate of the gods, emphasizing its spiritual significance. At this time, the city was a huge, bustling center, surrounded by massive walls, beyond which stretched gardens, temples, and busy markets. Around the 15th century BCE, on the historical stage appears Hammurabi, an ambitious and visionary ruler who changed history forever. During his reign, he transformed a small kingdom into a true empire, uniting disparate city-states of southern and central Mesopotamia. Hammurabi's most significant achievement was the creation of the first comprehensive code of laws in history, inscribed on a massive black stone stele. Imagine, more than 3,500 years ago, this monumental stone stood in the city centre, covered with hundreds of lines of cuneiform, informing people of the laws and rules. Anyone could approach, read, or request someone to read aloud, ensuring their rights were protected by the state. Among these laws, we know the famous rule: eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But Hammurabi's code was far more complex and comprehensive. It regulated nearly every aspect of society: trade, agriculture, marriage, divorce, theft, murder, the responsibilities of builders and doctors, even the care of orphans and widows. Although these laws may seem harsh today, in their era they represented wisdom and justice, protection against arbitrariness, and a guarantee of order in a rapidly growing society. Babylon under Hammurabi became a center of international politics and trade. Merchants from distant lands passed through the city, bringing bronze items, gold, and precious stones. Envoys of the Babylonian king traveled to neighboring states, forming alliances, negotiating, and corresponding with other powers. It was during this era that the oldest surviving diplomatic correspondence appeared on clay tablets, telling of complex and rich international relations. The Bronze Age was a time when separate civilizations began merging into a unified historical flow, exchanging culture, knowledge, and experience, laying the foundation for the development of humanity. Babylon and its great king, Hammurabi, stand at the very beginning of this long and remarkable journey. Now, having explored the rise of Babylon and Hammurabi's reign, we move slightly north to Upper Mesopotamia, where at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE, one of the most powerful ancient states begins to form: Assyria. Assyria emerged in the Tigris Valley, in what is now northern Iraq. The main center of this early state was the city of Ashur, named after the supreme god of the Assyrians. Originally, it was a small settlement under the cultural influence of Sumerians and Akkadians. By the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE, Ashur became an independent and ambitious state formation. The Assyrians became famous primarily as skilled warriors and organizers. Their early statehood developed under constant threat from neighbors, making military matters central to Assyrian culture. During this period, the traits that would define the later Assyrian Empire began to emerge: discipline, centralized administration, a developed army, and an efficient tax system. At the start, Assyria was not yet a great power. It was a trading city-state, actively interacting with other countries in the region. Trade played a key role. Assyrian merchants traveled hundreds of kilometers, especially to the region of Asia Minor, modern Turkey, where they established trading colonies. The most famous example of such a colony was Kanesh, an important trading center, where archaeologists found many cuneiform tablets documenting business deals, partnerships, and even legal disputes among Assyrian merchants. Gradually, consolidating their position, Assyria began an active foreign policy. By the 15th century BCE, Assyrian kings were already waging wars with neighboring tribes and cities, expanding their sphere of influence. At the same time, the cult of the king began to form, portraying him not only as a political leader, but also as divinely inspired, which would play an important role in the future ideology of the Assyrian Empire. Thus, early Assyria is an example of a state that grew based on trade, discipline, and the struggle for survival. Within its structure, a system was emerging that would eventually produce one of the most organized and formidable military machines of the ancient world. Although Assyria had not yet reached its peak, it was in this early period that the foundations of its future greatness were laid. Continuing the discussion of the Bronze Age in the ancient Near East, after the emergence and consolidation of centres like Babylon and Assyria, attention must be paid to other states that played a key role in international politics, trade, and cultural exchange. Among them, Mitanni, the Hittite kingdom, and Elam stand out, three states whose histories were closely intertwined with the fates of neighbouring peoples and kingdoms. Mitanni arose in the mid-2nd millennium BCE in northern Mesopotamia and southeastern Anatolia, in the area that today covers northern Syria and southern Turkey. The state formed after the fall of the old Babylonian kingdom, and for a time became one of the leading powers of the region. The Mitannians were an Indo-European people, possibly related to the Hurrians, and were renowned for their military strength, especially their cavalry. Their light two-wheeled chariots with archers represented a true revolution in warfare. Mitanni competed with Egypt and the Hittite kingdom for influence in Syria and Palestine. The diplomatic role of Mitanni was particularly notable. Archaeologists have found letters in the archives of Egyptian pharaohs showing that the kings of Mitanni conducted delicate negotiations, arranged marriages with Egyptian princesses, and actively participated in international politics. The Hittite kingdom formed in central Anatolia, on the territory of modern Turkey, around the early 2nd millennium BCE. It was the first state to systematically use iron, though bronze weapons and a well-organized army remained the basis of its military power. The capital, Hattusa, was surrounded by strong walls and adorned with temples and palaces. The Hittites conducted active foreign policy, particularly during the new Hittite Empire, engaging in fierce struggles with Egypt for control over key trade routes and the Syro-Palestinian region. One of the most famous events was the Battle of Kadesh between the Hittite king Muwatalli and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II, which ended with the signing of the first known written peace treaty in history. Elam, unlike Mitanni and the Hittite kingdom, was located further east in what is now southwestern Iran. The state had ancient roots dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE and actively interacted with the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians. During the Bronze Age, Elam experienced periods of both strength and decline, but always remained an important cultural and political player. Its capital was Susa, one of the oldest centres of civilization. Elamite culture was distinguished by its architecture, writing system, and religious traditions. Politically, Elam occasionally attacked Mesopotamia and even once captured Babylon, taking the famous stele of Hammurabi's laws. The Elamites engaged in complex diplomacy. Although they did not form an empire in the classical sense, they exerted a strong influence on the political processes of the region throughout the Bronze Age. Thus, Mitanni, the Hittite kingdom, and Elam exemplify the diversity and intense political life of the Near East during the Bronze Age. Each contributed in its own way to the formation of future civilizations, paving the way for the Iron Age. Continuing the study of Bronze Age civilizations after Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Iran, we turn to one of the most prominent cultures of the time, ancient Egypt of the New Kingdom. Between 1550 and 1070 BCE, Egypt reached the peak of its political, military, and cultural power, becoming the leading state of the Eastern Mediterranean. The New Kingdom began with the expulsion of the Hyksos, West Semitic tribes that had seized part of Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. Victory over them was achieved by Pharaoh Amosa, the first ruler of the Theban dynasty, who founded the 18th dynasty and restored national unity. From this moment, Egypt entered an era of expansion, reforms, and flourishing. One of the greatest rulers of the 18th dynasty was Thutmose II, who ruled in the mid-15th century BCE. After a prolonged regency of his stepmother Hatshepsut, he became sole ruler and conducted over 17 military campaigns in the Levant. In the famous Battle of Megiddo, he defeated a coalition of Canaanite princes, establishing Egyptian control over territories as far as the Euphrates. Under Thutmose II, Egypt achieved its greatest territorial expansion in history. The next significant stage is associated with Akhenaten, Amenhotep IV, who ruled in the mid-15th century BCE. He is remembered as a reformer, and the first pharaoh to attempt monotheism, promoting the worship of the sun god Aten. Akhenaten moved the capital to Akhetaten, modern Amarna, abandoned the cult of Amun, and prohibited traditional religious practices. Art of this period changed. Instead of idealized canonical images, realistic depictions of family life, the pharaoh with his wife Nefertiti and children, and symbolism of the sun disk appeared. After Akhenaten's death, his religious reforms were reversed and traditional beliefs restored. The young pharaoh Tutankhamun, c. 1330–1321 BCE, ascended the throne, abolishing the cult of Aten and restoring Amun's priesthood. Tutankhamun is not known for major reforms but became world famous when his nearly intact tomb was discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, providing invaluable insights into the culture, art, and daily life of Egyptian nobility. The true embodiment of Egypt's grandeur was Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great, who ruled for about 66 years, Imondesi, 1217–91 BCE. He built monumental temples including Ramesseum and Abu Simbel, adorned with reliefs and massive statues. On the international stage, Ramesses II faced the Hittite kingdom, especially at the famous Battle of Kadesh, c. 1270 BCE. Although it was not a decisive victory, several years later Egypt and the Hittites signed the first written peace treaty in history, recognizing equality between the states and including provisions for mutual aid and extradition of fugitives. By the end of the 10th century BCE, Egypt faced serious challenges: economic decline, unrest among priests and the army, and external threats. One of the most destructive was the invasion of the Sea Peoples, mysterious ethnic groups from the Aegean coast and Anatolia. They destroyed many cities in the eastern Mediterranean, ended the Hittite kingdom, and threatened Egypt itself. During the reign of Ramesses III, Egypt repelled these attacks by land and sea, but this was the last major military success of the state in the Bronze Age. By the early 10th century BCE, the new kingdom had declined. Centralized power weakened, priestly elites grew ambitious, internal conflicts increased, and Egypt's external authority diminished. This marked the end of one of ancient Egypt's most brilliant periods, leaving a legacy that continues to fascinate scholars, artists, and travelers. Continuing the Bronze Age narrative, we turn to the Aegean world, the southern Balkans and the Aegean Islands, where the earliest forms of European civilization emerged. The most significant cultures were the Minoan and Mycenaean, 16th to 10th centuries BCE. These societies created unique models of political and economic organization, developed art, religion, and writing, and served as a link between the Near East and Europe. The first fully developed civilization in the Aegean was the Minoan culture on Crete. Its name comes from the mythical king Minos. By the 3rd millennium BCE, advanced settlements existed on Crete, but the real flourishing occurred at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE. Monumental palaces were built at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, with living quarters, storage areas, ceremonial halls, throne rooms, and courtyards, decorated with frescoes depicting nature, bulls, dancing women, rituals, and maritime life. The Minoans created a centralized palace administration. The economy relied on agriculture, maritime trade, and crafts. Minoan ships sailed the eastern Mediterranean, maintaining contacts with Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, and the coast of Anatolia. Remarkably, Minoan culture left almost no evidence of large-scale warfare. No fortifications are found on Crete, and weapons appear rarely, suggesting a peaceful civilization. Minoan religion centered on the worship of a great goddess, female priesthood, bull symbolism, and the double axe, Labrys. Scholars believe Minoan myths later evolved into Greek legends of the Labyrinth, the Minotaur, and King Minos. Minoan writing, Linear A, remains undeciphered and was used for administrative and ritual purposes. Around the mid-15th century BCE, Crete suffered a catastrophe. Palaces were destroyed and settlements burned, likely due to a massive volcanic eruption on Thera, Santorini, which caused tsunamis and climate disruption. Crete was not entirely abandoned, but the Minoan culture gradually lost autonomy, and palace reconstruction occurred under the influence of incoming Mycenaeans from the mainland. On mainland Greece, the Mycenaean, Achaean civilization emerged, named after the city of Mycenae, one of the era's most powerful centres, along with Tiryns, Pylos, Athens and Thebes. Unlike the Minoans, Mycenaeans were warlike. Their palaces were built as fortresses. Cyclopean walls of massive stones surrounded citadels, palaces, storage areas and workshops. The Lion Gate at Mycenae became an architectural symbol of power. The Mycenaeans adopted Minoan palace organisation and writing, adapting it to their language. Linear B, c. 10th century BCE, was used for administrative records. It is one of the earliest forms of Greek, deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952. Tablets from Pylos, Mycenae and other centres record the distribution of goods, metal and textile supplies, and population censuses. Mycenaean society was hierarchical. At the top stood the Wonax, king, wielding military and administrative power. Beneath him were warriors, landowners, craftsmen and priests. Their religion included elements that later entered the Greek pantheon, with Linear B inscriptions mentioning Zeus, Hera, Poseidon and Athena. The 10th century BCE marked the height of the Mycenaean world, which influenced the Aegean islands, Crete, coastal Anatolia and Cyprus. Archaeological evidence shows trade with Egypt and the Levant and military presence in some regions. Many scholars associate this period with the legendary Trojan War, later immortalised in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Around the 10th century BCE, a sharp decline began. Palace centres in Mycenaean Greece were destroyed, writing disappeared, architecture simplified, and trade collapsed. This initiated the so-called Dark Age, lasting nearly 200 years, with scant historical evidence. The causes of the collapse remain debated. Sea peoples' invasions, internal conflict, resource depletion, earthquakes, climate change, or systemic administrative failure. The Aegean Bronze Age represents a unique stage in European civilization. The Minoans contributed to the region's cultural foundations, and the Mycenaeans laid the groundwork for what would become classical Greece. Their architecture, social structures, religion and writing form the basis of later European history. After the Mycenaean collapse and the Egyptian crisis, the Late Bronze Age entered a mysterious and dramatic period. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean experienced near-simultaneous destruction of complex administrations, palace centres, international trade routes and cultural networks that had existed for centuries. The collapse affected the Balkans, Levant, mainland Greece, Anatolia, Cyprus, Syria, and much of Egypt. Palace centres were destroyed. Mycenae, Pylos and Tiryns burned. Hattusa in Anatolia disappeared. Enkomi on Cyprus vanished. Ugarit in the Levant ceased to exist. Archaeologists record signs of fires, destruction of crafts, abandonment of palace grain storage, and disappearance of stone and brick public buildings. Large centres were replaced by small, often temporary settlements lacking monumental architecture. The international trade network connecting Egypt, the Levant, Hittite lands, Mycenae and Mesopotamia collapsed. Sea routes that supplied metals, especially tin for bronze, were disrupted. The production of bronze artefacts and imports of Eastern amphorae declined. Economies reliant on imports became unstable, causing social unrest and famine. In this context, the Sea Peoples emerged, scattered groups of migrants, warriors and possibly refugees moving westward and northwestward into Eastern Mediterranean coastal areas. Egyptian texts from the late 19th and 20th dynasties describe them as organised tribal coalitions attacking by land and sea, including the Shekelesh, Peleset, Shurdan and others. Some groups settled in former states' territories, Josais the Peleset, future Philistines in southern Canaan. One notable conflict was Egypt's defence under Ramesses III, c. 1170 BCE, when the army and fleet repelled a major Sea Peoples invasion. Reliefs at Medinet Habu depict fierce battles using chariots and naval forces. Despite victory, Egypt lost influence in Asia, limiting its foreign policy to border defence. The consequences were devastating. Over the following centuries, writing systems disappeared, temple and administrative architecture declined, and populations in most regions decreased. Material culture reverted to handmade pottery, simplified tools, and primitive agriculture. In some areas, such as mainland Greece, stone construction ceased, replaced by wooden structures scarcely detectable archaeologically. This period became known as the Dark Ages. However, culture did not vanish entirely. Small, decentralized communities preserved crafts, folk religious practices, and emerging ethnic traditions. During this period, the transition from bronze to iron gradually occurred, not as a result of technological progress but due to shortages of traditional materials. Iron became a more accessible alternative, gradually replacing bronze. By the 6th century BCE, signs of recovery appeared in the eastern Mediterranean. In Greece, early proto-urban settlements such as Lefkandi and Smyrna emerged. Greek writing began to develop based on the Phoenician alphabet. In Phoenicia, the cities of Tyre and Sidon flourished, expanding maritime trade and colonization. Assyria regained its status as a great power, seizing surviving territories of former Hittite and Aramean cities. On the biblical lands, Israel and Judah formed. All this marks the transition from the post-Bronze Age collapse to a new historical cycle, the beginning of the Iron Age, and the formation of a new civilizational landscape. Having completed the study of the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations and the subsequent transitional period, we enter a new era, the Iron Age, spanning roughly from 1200 to 500 BCE. During this time, profound transformations occurred in the East, facilitating the emergence of new states and empires. In this context, Assyria serves as a striking example of how a small kingdom that preserved its statehood during the post-Bronze Age crisis could evolve into a powerful empire, reshaping the political map of the ancient Near East. The history of Assyria in the Iron Age can be divided into two interconnected phases, each characterized by specific transformations in governance, military organization, and cultural development. The Middle Assyrian period began in the late 14th century BCE and continued until the early 1st millennium BCE. During this period, Assyria, despite facing both internal and external challenges, managed to restore its autonomy and initiate expansion. The ancient city of Ashur remained the heart of the state, gradually evolving into the administrative core around which the governmental system developed. Under the rule of Ashur-uballit I, who reigned in the second half of the 14th century BCE, Assyria began expanding its borders through conquests in Upper Mesopotamia, and by strengthening ties with neighbouring peoples. Archaeological evidence indicates the construction of stone fortresses, large temples and palaces, and the use of early forms of written record-keeping, pointing to the emergence of a centralised state. Successive rulers, including Adad-nirari III, Shalmaneser I, and Tukulti-Ninurta I, continued policies of expansion and centralisation. During the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta I in the 13th century BCE, Assyria temporarily conquered Babylon and implemented a system of direct administration over conquered territories. Provinces were established, governors appointed, regular taxation and military garrisons organised, and population resettlements carried out to suppress revolts. These measures strengthened Assyria's control over its territories and laid the foundation for the future empire. The transition to the Neo-Assyrian Empire occurred at the beginning of the 1st millennium BCE. Ashur-dan II, who ascended the throne in 911 BCE, was the first prominent ruler of this period. His policies of active expansion and governmental reform set the stage for Assyria's transformation into a full-fledged empire. His successors, including Adad-nirari II, Tiglath-Pileser II, Shalmaneser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and finally Ashurbanipal, steadily expanded the state's territory. Under Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyria implemented large-scale administrative reforms. The system of vassal kingdoms was replaced with direct provincial administration, a regular taxation system was introduced, and standardized military supply lines were established. Systematic resettlements of conquered populations also occurred, strengthening both imperial control and cultural assimilation. The Neo-Assyrian Empire reached its peak in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE. Assyria conquered vast territories, stretching from the Zagros Mountains to the Persian Gulf, and from the Caucasus to the eastern Mediterranean. Strategically important centres included not only the traditional city of Ashur, but also the newly expanded capital of Nineveh, which was transformed into one of the largest cities of the ancient world. Under the reigns of Sennacherib and Esarhaddon, Nineveh became the political, cultural, and economic heart of the empire, as evidenced by numerous reliefs, inscriptions, and other artistic monuments. Of particular significance was the reign of Ashurbanipal in the 6th century BCE, under whom Assyria achieved its highest cultural and administrative development. Ashurbanipal established the famous library at Nineveh, containing tens of thousands of clay tablets written in Akkadian, Sumerian, and other languages. This library provides invaluable insight into the religion, mythology, history, legal systems, and scientific knowledge of ancient Mesopotamia. Archaeological excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries allowed scholars to reconstruct many aspects of Assyrian culture and governance. The military power of Assyria during this period was characterized by strict discipline, innovative siege machinery, chariot warfare, well-organized infantry, and later, cavalry. The system of mass resettlements implemented by Assyrian rulers not only prevented uprisings, but also integrated conquered territories into a unified administrative framework, contributing to the long-term stability of the empire despite frequent internal rebellions and external threats. By the late 7th century BCE, however, the Assyrian Empire began to experience severe pressure. Internal conflicts, prolonged wars, and constant military campaigns strained the state's resources. External forces, including the Medes and Babylonians, united to deliver a decisive defeat. In 612 BCE, Nineveh was captured and destroyed, and by 609 BCE, the last Assyrian stronghold fell, ending one of the earliest examples of a powerful centralized empire and leaving a rich legacy in governance, military strategy, architecture, and culture. Assyria's influence persisted in subsequent civilizations. Its administrative models, military technologies, and artistic traditions were reflected in the Babylonian, Achaemenid, and Roman empires. The Assyrians demonstrated how the systematic organization of power, integration of diverse peoples through resettlement, and effective management of conquered territories could form the foundation of an empire capable of governing a multi-ethnic realm for centuries. Following the fall of the Assyrian Empire, a new geopolitical order emerged in the Near East. Central Mesopotamia, previously an Assyrian province, became the center of conflict among various claimants to the territory of the fallen empire. In this context, the Neo-Babylonian kingdom, also known as the Chaldean state, arose, existing from 626 to 539 BCE. The founder of the kingdom was Nabopolassar, a Chaldean leader who spearheaded the revolt against Assyria in southern Mesopotamia. His uprising, beginning around 626 BCE, quickly gained support from the Medes, particularly their king Cyaxares. Through joint military campaigns, the Assyrian capital, Nineveh, was captured and destroyed in 612 BCE. The last resistance center, the city of Harran, fell in 609 BCE. Thus ended the history of the Assyrian Empire, giving rise to the Neo-Babylonian kingdom. The reign of Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, marked the pinnacle of the new state. He ascended the throne in 605 BCE after commanding forces to victory at the decisive Battle of Carchemish, where the Babylonians defeated the Egyptians and remaining Assyrian troops. This victory secured Babylonian control over Syria and Palestine, expelling Egypt from the Near Eastern arena. Nebuchadnezzar II ruled for nearly 43 years, conducting numerous large-scale military campaigns. In 597 BCE, he besieged and captured Jerusalem, taking King Jeconiah and a portion of the population into exile in Babylon. Following a subsequent revolt in Judea in 586 BCE, he destroyed Jerusalem and the First Temple, deporting tens of thousands of Jews. This period, known as the Babylonian exile, had a profound impact on the religious and cultural identity of the Jewish people. In addition to military achievements, Nebuchadnezzar was a renowned builder and patron of science. Babylon was fortified with double walls, towers, and gates. Among the most famous constructions were the Ishtar Gates, adorned with blue-glazed bricks and reliefs of lions, bulls, and dragons. The city also featured canals, bridges, temples, and vast palace complexes. According to classical sources, the legendary Hanging Gardens of Semiramis were created during his reign, although historians still debate their actual location and existence. The scientific and religious life of the Neo-Babylonian kingdom also flourished. Sumerian Akkadian traditions continued in the temples, where priests observed celestial bodies, tracking planetary movements and eclipses. These observations formed the basis for astronomical tables and calendars, later used in Hellenistic and Islamic science. Mathematics also developed, particularly in geometry and calculations related to land measurement. In legal matters, Hammurabi's code remained influential, adapted to the kingdom's new political realities. After Nebuchadnezzar II's death in 562 BCE, the state gradually declined. His successors lacked his charisma and political skill, and palace coups destabilized centralized authority. A particularly notable figure in the kingdom's final decades was Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, who ruled from 556 BCE. He sought to revive the cult of the moon god Sin, possibly at the expense of Marduk's traditional cult, causing friction with the powerful priesthood. At the same time, a new power rose rapidly in the east. Persia, led by Cyrus II, later called the Great. In 539 BCE, his army approached Babylon. According to historical accounts, the city surrendered without significant resistance. Cyrus demonstrated religious and political pragmatism, recognizing Marduk's cult, leaving temples intact, and allowing exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands, as recorded in the famous Cyrus Cylinder, one of the earliest known documents promoting religious and ethnic tolerance. Thus concluded the history of the Neo-Babylonian kingdom, one of the last great Mesopotamian states. It served as a bridge between ancient Sumerian Akkadian traditions and subsequent eras, transmitting knowledge, architectural forms, and political and legal models to later civilizations of the East. Despite its relatively short existence, the kingdom left a lasting imprint on the history of the Near East and world culture. After the fall of the Neo-Babylonian kingdom in 539 BCE, political and military leadership in the Near East passed to a new power, the Persian state of the Achaemenid dynasty. Its formal foundation is associated with the reign of Cyrus II, who hailed from the lineage that ruled the region of Pars, Persis, in southwestern Iran. His dynasty quickly transformed from a regional house into the ruling power of the largest empire of the ancient world. By the end of the 6th century BCE, Persia controlled vast territories stretching from the Indus River in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west, encompassing Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Anatolia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. The scale of this empire was unprecedented. In the history of the ancient world, no state before this had been able to govern such diverse cultural, linguistic, and ethnic regions. Against this backdrop, the formal institutional organization of power was as important as military conquest. Administrative reforms were completed under Darius I, who reigned from 522 to 486 BCE. He systematically divided the empire into approximately 20 administrative districts, known as satrapies, each governed by a royal governor or satrap. Satraps wielded considerable authority but remained under the oversight of the king. Inspectors, sent from the capital as the king's eyes, monitored loyalty and administrative efficiency. Some satrapies, such as Egypt, Babylonia, and Lydia, enjoyed special status due to their wealth and strategic importance. Efficient communication networks were also vital for governing the empire. The Royal Road, stretching roughly 2,700 kilometers from Sardis to Susa, connected the empire's west and east. Along its route, relay stations allowed couriers to change horses and transmit royal decrees. Herodotus claimed that a journey that would take an ordinary traveller 3 months could be completed by a royal messenger in just over a week. This infrastructure, combined with security and oversight, made centralized administration over such a vast territory feasible. The empire maintained order while ensuring freedom of trade, movement, and religion. Persian kings respected local traditions and cults. The gods of conquered peoples were not destroyed, temples were preserved and restored, and religious practices continued. Persian rulers even allowed the Jews to return from Babylonian exile and rebuild the Second Temple in Jerusalem, cementing their legacy in Jewish tradition as liberators. Egyptian priests continued rituals honouring Osiris and Ra, and Babylonian priests celebrated Akitu for Marduk. The personal religion of the kings was linked to Zoroastrianism, the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster, which emerged in Iran at the end of the 2nd and beginning of the 1st millennium BCE. According to this faith, the world is a battleground between light and darkness, truth and falsehood. The chief god, Ahura Mazda, symbolized truth, order, and wisdom. Darius the Fern referred to himself as king by the will of Ahura Mazda, and, in inscriptions such as the Behistun inscription, emphasized that his authority was sanctioned not only by inheritance, but also by divine right. The culture of the Achaemenid Empire was a synthesis of Persian, Median, Babylonian, Elamite, Egyptian, Greek, and other traditions, reflected in the architecture of capitals such as Pasargadae, Ecbatana, Susa, and especially Persepolis. Persepolis, a monumental palace complex begun under Darius, became a symbol of imperial grandeur. Its columned halls reached over 20 meters in height, and tiered staircases featured bas-reliefs depicting delegations from across the empire, from Scythians to Ethiopians, from Indians to Lydians, bearing tribute to the king. However, even an empire of such scale could not avoid conflict with external forces. In the west, the Greek cities of Anatolia, formerly part of Lydia and later under Persian rule, posed a challenge. In 500 BCE, the Ionian Revolt began, a series of uprisings by the Greeks against Persian administration. After suppressing the revolt, Darius the Feather sought to punish mainland Greece for supporting the rebels. In 490 BCE, the Persian army landed at Marathon, but was defeated by the Athenians. 10 years later, under Xerxes the First, Persia launched a second invasion, with an army estimated between 100,000 and 200,000, crossing the Hellespont. Yet after the heroic defence at Thermopylae and the naval battle at Salamis, the campaign ended in failure. Persian expansion into Greece ceased, though the empire maintained internal stability and continued to thrive. By the 5th century BCE, the Persian kings ruled over more than 70 peoples. Official correspondence was conducted in multiple languages, including Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian, and Aramaic, the latter becoming the empire's administrative language and long serving as the Near East's international lingua franca. The fall of the Achaemenids would come later, with Alexander the Great. Yet long before that, the Achaemenid Persians had established enduring standards of imperial power, legal systems, tolerance, and cultural diversity that would serve as models for Rome, Byzantium, the Sasanian Empire, and other great states. Alongside these great Eastern empires, two peoples with entirely different trajectories also shaped the cultural and political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean during the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, the Phoenicians and the ancient Israelites. The Phoenicians, inhabiting a narrow coastal strip between the sea and the Lebanon mountains, did not form a centralized state. Instead, a network of independent city-states such as Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arvad, and Ugarit existed. These cities, interacting extensively with each other, formed what was called the Hanse, a maritime and trade alliance based on seafaring and economic cooperation. The Phoenician economy revolved around maritime trade, shipbuilding, metallurgy, and textile production. They became particularly famous for purple and violet dyes derived from mollusks. Phoenicians also developed a simplified script, consisting of consonantal signs, which later formed the basis for the Greek and then Latin alphabets, leaving a lasting impact on the written culture of the Mediterranean. From the 6th century BCE, the Phoenicians actively established colonies along the coast, from Cyprus to the Atlantic. Among them, Carthage, founded by settlers from Tyre around 814 BCE, became an independent centre of trade and naval power, developing its own culture, religion, and political system, while maintaining links with its mother city. Meanwhile, in southern Canaan, early Israelite kingdoms emerged. According to biblical tradition, after the period of the Judges, the tribes united to form a monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon. During Solomon's reign, around the mid-10th century BCE, the first temple in Jerusalem was built, becoming the religious and political centre. After Solomon's death, the United Kingdom split. Israel emerged in the north with Samaria as its capital, and Judah in the south, with Jerusalem as its center. Israel fell to Assyrian conquests in 722 BCE, and part of the population was deported. Judah survived longer, but eventually fell under Babylonian dominance. In 597 BCE, Jerusalem was besieged, and in 586 BCE it was destroyed, including the first temple, and a significant portion of the population was exiled to Babylon. This period, known in Jewish tradition as the Babylonian captivity, prompted a rethinking of national identity, reinforced the concept of monotheism, and saw the compilation of key portions of the Hebrew Scriptures. Return from exile became possible under the Persian king, who allowed repatriation and the rebuilding of the temple, marking a new stage in religious history that eventually led to the classical form of Judaism. Thus, the Phoenicians, through trade, navigation, and the spread of writing, linked the cultures of East and West, while the Israelite and Judean kingdoms laid the foundations of a religious tradition that would become a cornerstone of the spiritual history of much of humanity. In the second half of the second millennium BCE, Indo-European tribes, later referred to in Indian tradition as Aryans, began migrating into the Indian subcontinent. This migration was part of the broader movement of Indo-European peoples across Europe, Central and South Asia. The Aryans initially settled in the Indus Valley after crossing the northwestern frontiers, later advancing into the Ganges Valley, where they interacted with local populations, possibly descendants of the Harappan civilization. Information about this period is primarily drawn from Vedic literature, especially the Rig Veda, the oldest of the four Vedic collections, likely compiled between the 10th and 9th centuries BCE. The Rig Veda is a collection of over 1,000 hymns addressed to various deities. These texts were transmitted orally for centuries, ensuring their preservation in nearly unchanged form. Early Vedic society was semi-nomadic. The Aryans practiced animal husbandry, agriculture, hunting and ritual sacrifices, living in clan-based groups called janas, led by a chieftain known as a Rajan. As territories expanded and intertribal conflicts emerged, the role of a warrior class increased. Priests, or Brahmins, were central to ritual life, overseeing key life events with complex ceremonies and hymns. Over time, Aryan society became more complex. The later Vedic texts, especially the Yajurveda and Samaveda, mention a social hierarchy expressed in the Varna system. According to the myth in the Purusha Sukta, 4 social classes emerged from the body of the primordial being Purusha: Brahmins from the mouth, Kshatriyas from the arms, Vaishyas from the thighs, and Shudras from the feet. This system symbolized not merely a division of labor, but a sacred societal model, with each individual occupying a place defined by cosmic order. A key element of Vedic religion was the yajna sacrifice, involving the recitation of mantras, offerings to the gods, and complex ceremonies requiring trained priests. Principal deities included Indra, ruler of rain and thunder; Agni, god of sacrificial fire; Soma, personification of the sacred drink; and Varuna, guardian of moral order. Offerings included animals, grains, oil, milk, and occasionally symbolic sacrifices, with the belief that proper rituals maintained the cosmic order, Artha. With population growth and settlement along the fertile Ganges plains, the Aryans began forming proto-state structures, establishing intertribal connections and developing governance systems. By the first half of the first millennium BCE, early Mahajanapadas, or large political entities, emerged. Among these, Magadha, in present-day Bihar, and Kosala, along the middle Ganges, played particularly important roles. These states featured stable bureaucracies, professional armies, and tax systems. Some were ruled by hereditary monarchs, others by oligarchies dominated by councils of nobles. During this period, religious thought evolved from Vedic rituals to more philosophical practices. Texts known as the Upanishads introduced concepts such as the transmigration of souls, samsara, the law of moral causation, karma, liberation, moksha, and the identification of the individual self, Atman, with the universal absolute, Brahman. These ideas became foundational for future Indian religious and philosophical traditions. At the same time, written records began to appear, likely influenced by contact with Western cultures, marking the early development of Sanskrit grammar and linguistic philosophy, which would later reach its peak in classical texts. Thus, the Vedic period was a time of profound cultural, social, and religious transformation, during which the Indian subcontinent transitioned from tribal settlements to emerging states with structured social institutions and rich spiritual traditions. This period laid the foundations for the key institutions that would shape Indian civilization for centuries to come. By the second half of the first millennium BCE, new political and cultural centers emerged, marking the culmination of the Iron Age and foreshadowing the empires of antiquity. Key players in this transitional period included Carthage in the Western Mediterranean and the Hellenistic states of the Eastern Mediterranean that emerged after Alexander the Great's empire fractured. Carthage, founded by settlers from Phoenician Tyre around 814 BCE, initially functioned as one of many trading colonies serving Phoenician merchants and navigators. However, its strategic location on the North African coast and control over maritime routes between east and west enabled the city to gain economic and political autonomy. By the 6th century BCE, Carthage had become an independent trading empire, controlling North African coasts, southern Iberia, the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Corsica, western Sicily, and parts of Gaul. Its economic power rested on maritime trade, metallurgy, crafts, and agriculture, including irrigated farming. Carthaginian agronomists produced treatises on agriculture, the most famous being Margot, translated into Greek and Latin. Trade networks extended from the British Isles and Atlantic coast to the eastern Mediterranean. Carthage maintained a strong naval fleet, with hundreds of ships docked in its harbours. Multi-level docks allowed rapid repair and outfitting of vessels. Politically, Carthage was an oligarchic republic. Supreme authority was shared by 2 elected magistrates, Suffet, while a council of elders, Gerousia, and an assembly existed, though the latter's power declined over time. Governance was dominated by a few wealthy families, such as the Barcids and Magons, ensuring stability but limiting quick responses to external threats. Carthaginian religion preserved Phoenician traditions, with principal gods Baal, Hammon, and Tanit. Evidence of child sacrifices in Tophets, ritual cemeteries containing urns with infant and animal remains, has led ancient sources to accuse Carthaginians of blood rituals. Modern scholars debate whether these were regular rituals or burials of children who died naturally. From the 5th century BCE, Carthage actively competed with Greek cities in Sicily, especially Syracuse, leading to protracted conflicts that drained both sides' resources. Concurrently, Carthage faced a new power, Rome, culminating in the Punic Wars, which ended with the city's destruction in the 2nd century BCE. Until that point, Carthage remained a major economic, military, and cultural hub, exemplifying the synthesis of Eastern and Western traditions. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Mediterranean, new Hellenistic states emerged from the partition of Alexander the Great's short-lived empire. Alexander began his conquest in 334 BCE, crossing the Hellespont and defeating Darius III. Over 11 years, he conquered Asia Minor, Levant, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Iran, and part of India, founding numerous cities, the most famous being Alexandria in Egypt, which became a cultural capital of the Hellenistic world. After Alexander's death in Babylon in 323 BCE, his empire was divided among his generals, the Diadochi, forming major states: the Seleucid Empire, Syria to Bactria, Egypt under the Ptolemies, Macedonia, and smaller realms including Pergamon, Bithynia, Cappadocia, and the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. The Hellenistic era featured intense cultural exchange. Greek became the language of administration and science, and Greek schools and gymnasia were established in eastern cities. Hellenization did not erase local traditions but produced syncretism. In Alexandria, Seleucia, Antioch, and other cities, temples, libraries, and theatres were built. Artistic schools merged Greek and Eastern styles, and unique religious cults combined Greek and Near Eastern elements. New philosophical and esoteric movements emerged, reflecting the spiritual pursuits of the multicultural population. Thus, in the late Iron Age, Carthage and the Hellenistic East represented two distinct but complementary models of post-Bronze Age civilization: a maritime aristocratic republic in the west and multi-ethnic monarchies in the east, both serving as conduits for cultural synthesis, political innovation, and scientific progress that would shape the classical world. After the disappearance of the Hellenistic monarchies and the incorporation of the wealthiest eastern regions, Egypt, Syria, Judea, and Asia Minor, into the orbit of Roman power, the Mediterranean was united under the control of a single state. The destruction of Carthage, the subjugation of the Hellenistic East, and Rome's victories in a series of internal civil wars, culminating in the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, marked a turning point between classical antiquity and a new era. This period, which historians call Late Antiquity, spans over 4 centuries, from the last quarter of the 1st century BCE to the final fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. A pivotal moment in the political structure of the Roman world was the establishment of personal power by Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar. Octavian, having united the army, the fleet, the Roman elite, and the provincial aristocracy under his command, formally renounced extraordinary powers in 27 BCE, but received from the Senate the title Augustus and the authority to govern extensive provinces. This marked the beginning of the Principate, a unique compromise between republican institutions and de facto monarchy. The emperor retained supreme military command, control over finances, the right to appoint governors and magistrates, as well as religious authority. Augustus's rule laid the foundation for the stabilization and restoration of the state. After decades of instability, he reformed the army, fixing its strength at around 25 legions, created a professional military with a fixed system of service and pensions, and established the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard. Provinces were divided into imperial and senatorial territories. The taxation system was unified, regular censuses were introduced, civil service opportunities expanded, and the road infrastructure developed. At the same time, Augustus encouraged the restoration of temples, traditional cults, and moral values, presenting himself as a continuation of ancient Roman virtues. The period from the end of the 1st century to the beginning of the 2nd century CE is considered the empire's peak. Under emperors such as Tiberius, Claudius, Vespasian, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, the territory of Rome reached its greatest extent. Under Trajan, it stretched from Scotland to the Persian Gulf, from the Rhine and Danube to the Sahara. Cities, trade, and agriculture developed, and Roman citizenship expanded. At the beginning of the 2nd century under Caracalla, almost all free inhabitants of the empire were granted citizenship. Simultaneously, Roman architecture, law, Latin and Greek languages spread. The empire became increasingly multi-ethnic and urbanized. However, by the second half of the 2nd century, signs of an impending crisis appeared. The epidemic known as the Antonine Plague affected many regions, causing significant demographic losses. Germanic and Sarmatian tribes intensified raids on the northern borders. The army became increasingly influential in political life, proclaiming emperors on the battlefield. From 235 CE began the so-called crisis of the 3rd century. Over 50 years, emperors changed rapidly, often dying as a result of uprisings, intrigues, or military defeats. The army increasingly controlled political appointments. The empire de facto split into several parts. In Gaul and Britain, the separate Gallic Empire arose. In Syria and Egypt, the Palmyrene kingdom temporarily emerged. At the same time, pressure intensified from Sassanid Persia in the east and Germanic tribes on the Rhine and Danube. The financial system deteriorated, the silver content of coins declined, inflation rose, trade contracted, and urbanization slowed. An attempt to halt the decline was made by Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 285 CE. He implemented a series of reforms aimed at centralizing administration and tightening control. The empire was divided among 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars, forming the Tetrarchy. Provinces were enlarged and combined into dioceses. A stricter taxation system was introduced, and the army's structure was organized. Diocletian also sought religious unification. During his reign, the largest and final persecution of Christians in the history of ancient Rome began. motivated by the desire to preserve state unity based on traditional cults. However, in the early 4th century, a decisive turn occurred. Constantine, the son of one of the Caesars, after a series of military confrontations, became the sole ruler. In 313 CE, together with Licinius, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting Christians the right to freely practice their faith. In the following years, Constantine actively patronized the church, transferred property to it, elevated Christian bishops, and participated in religious disputes. In 325 CE, he convened the First Ecumenical Council in Nicaea, where the basic doctrines of the Christian faith were formulated. Simultaneously, Constantine moved the capital from Rome to the east to the city of Byzantium, renamed Constantinople. The city was founded in 324 CE, solemnly consecrated in 337 CE, and soon became the new administrative and spiritual center of the empire.